Moving on to round 17. This round is going to be pretty simple. We're going to do V-stitches into all of our V-stitches as well as all 3 of the chain 2 spaces in this V-stitch, chain 2 V-stitch section. And so we are going to get started by slip stitching into that first V-stitch, chain 4, and put a double crochet into that same space. And that's going to serve as always as our first V-stitch. We're going to chain 2 and go into the next V-stitch with a V-stitch. Okay, we're going to chain 2 again, and we're going to put a V-stitch into this next chain 2 space, which technically is a V-stitch. We're going to chain 2. We're going to put into the next chain 2 space a V-stitch. We're going to chain 2 again, and we're going to put a V-stitch into this third chain 2 space of this V-stitch, chain 2 V-stitch section. So this V-stitch, chain 2 V-stitch, where there's 3 chain 2s in the top of this V-stitch, is just going to have V-stitch, chain 2, V-stitch, chain 2, V-stitch, and you're going to be putting those V-stitches in those 3 chain 2 spaces. Go ahead and chain 2. You're going to put a V-stitch in the next V-stitch. Chain 2 and put a V-stitch in that 5th V-stitch. All right, so we are going to be skipping over our single crochet section here and going straight into this next V-stitch. We're not going to chain 2, okay, but this is where your repeat starts. So we're going to do a V-stitch and a V-stitch, chain 2 twice. So go ahead and go into this V-stitch with a double crochet, chain 2, and a double crochet. You're going to chain 2. Put a V-stitch in the next V-stitch. Chain 2. And now we're back to this V-stitch, chain 2, V-stitch section, and that's we're going to do a V-stitch, chain 2 into all 3 of these chain 2 sections. So my first V-stitch, I'm going to chain 2. I'm going to do a second V-stitch. Sorry about that hair, the cat. We're going to chain 2. We're going to put a V-stitch in the next chain 2 space. We're going to chain 2 and put a V-stitch in the next V-stitch. We're going to chain 2 and put a V-stitch in that last V-stitch, and that should take you back to the single crochet that we're going to skip. And you're going to repeat that all the way around, where these 2 V-stitches are going to create this little V section above our pineapple, just like it did down in our first set of pineapples. Oh, this is our first set of pineapples, excuse me. So you're going to repeat that around 7 more times, and that's going to wrap you up with 63 V-stitches and 117 chain 2 spaces. So V-stitch and V-stitch, chain 2, V-stitch and V-stitch, chain 2, V-stitch in a chain 2 space, chain 2, V-stitch and a chain 2 space, chain 2, V-stitch and a V-stitch, then we're going to chain 2, put a V-stitch and a V-stitch, chain 2 and a V-stitch and a V-stitch all the way around. All right, so I've come to the end of my 63 V-stitches. We're at the top of our last pineapple, and we're going to slip stitch into the second chain of our chain 4, and that completes round 17. Moving into round 18, we are going to be slip stitching into that V-stitch. You're going to chain up 4, and for this round we're not going to be putting a full V-stitch into this stitch. This chain 4 is going to serve as a double crochet and a chain 1 space. Now your repeat is going to start here, and we're going to do 5 trebles into the next V-stitch. that makes 2. I'm gonna do 3, 4, and 5. Go ahead and chain 1, put a V-stitch in the next V-stitch. You're going to chain 1 and put 5 trebles into the next V-stitch. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, chain 1, put a V-stitch in the next V-stitch. I'm going to turn my work. We're going to chain 1, and you're going to put 5 trebles in the next V-stitch. So 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Okay, so now you're going to chain 1, and you're going to do a double crochet, chain 2, and then a double crochet. So this should be the top of your pineapple, where we put 2 V-stitches in row 17 without chaining between them. And so this is going to be considered a V-stitch. We're going to do a double crochet into the first V-stitch, chain 1, 2, and then you're going to do a double crochet into the next V-stitch. All right, and you're going to chain 1, and that's going to complete our repeat. So let's do it one more time together, and then I'll have you repeat it by yourself 6 more times. So we've already chained 1, and now we need to do 5 trebles into the next V-stitch. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, chain 1, do a V-stitch into the next V-stitch. So double crochet, chain 2, double crochet, chain 1, and put 5 trebles into the next V-stitch. 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. We're going to chain 1, put a V-stitch in the next V-stitch, give me a second to pull my yarn. I did a cake with this yarn and it was not a good idea. Finish that V-stitch. I'm going to chain 1, and I'm going to do 5 trebles into the next V-stitch. 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Go ahead and chain 1, and now we're back to the end of our repeat where we put a double crochet into the next V-stitch, we chain 2 and put a double crochet into the next V-stitch and chain 1, and that's going to complete your repeat. Go ahead and do that all the way around. When you get to the end, you're going to do a double crochet in this V-stitch, a chain 2, and you're going to slip stitch to the 3rd chain of that chain 4. All right, I've come to the end of my round. I'm going to put a double crochet in my last V-stitch. I'm going to chain 2, and I'm going to slip stitch to that 3rd chain space in the side as well as the back bump to complete my round. And for round 18 at the end, you're going to have 135 trebles, 18 V-stitches, 54 chain 1 spaces, 27 chain 2 spaces, which will include all of your V-stitches, including these V-stitches at the top of the pineapples that are a double crochet, chain 2, double crochet into 2 different V-stitches. And so now we're going to move on to round 19. So moving on to round 19, you are going to slip stitch to the chain space. Okay. Go ahead and slip stitch all the way to your third treble. 1, 2, and 3. So that's a total of 4 slip stitches. You're going to chain up 4 and put a double crochet in that same space. Okay. Now we're going to chain 3 and put a V-stitch in the next V-stitch. And this chain 3 V-stitch is going to serve as the beginning of our repeat. Then you're going to chain 3 and put a V-stitch in the third treble. And that'll complete the repeat. Let's do that again together. And you're going to repeat this all the way around. So chain 3, V-stitch and V-stitch, chain 3, and a V-stitch in the third treble of your 5 treble clusters. Repeat that all the way around, and you will have, for row 19, 54 V-stitches and 54 chain 3 spaces. All right, I've come to the end of round 19. I'm going to put my last V-stitch into that chain 2 space between those individual double crochets. I'm going to chain 3 and slip stitch to the second chain of our chain 4. And that's going to complete our round. Again, you should have 54 V-stitches and 54 chain 3 spaces. Moving on to round 20. So we are going to be slip stitching into the middle of our first V-stitch. We're going to chain up 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. We're going to put a double crochet into that same V-stitch. Okay, and now this is where our repeat's going to start. We're going to chain 1 and we're going to do 7 trebles into the next V-stitch. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7. You're going to chain 1 and put a V-stitch in the next V-stitch. And that completes our repeat. So you're going to repeat this around, let's see, 26 times, and you will end with 7 trebles in this V-stitch in a chain 1, and we will slip stitch together into the second chain. All right, I've just made my last 7 treble cluster. I'm going to chain 1 and I'm going to slip stitch to the second chain of that chain 4 through the side as well as the back bump, and that's going to complete round 20. And so at the end of this round you should have 189 trebles, you should have 27 V-stitches and 54 chain spaces. Moving on to round 21. This one is going to be really similar to round 19. We're going to slip stitch into the V-stitch. We're going to chain up 4, put a double crochet in that same space, and now your repeat's going to start. Chain 4 and put a V-stitch in the middle treble, which is the 4th treble of that 7 treble cluster. Chain 4, and you guessed it, we're going to put a V-stitch in the V-stitch. So you will repeat this chain 4, V-stitch in the 4th treble, chain 4, V-stitch and a V-stitch all the way around, and at the end of this round you're going to have 54 V-stitches and 54 chain 4 spaces. Alright, to wrap up row 21, we're going to slip stitch into the side as well as the back bump of our second chain. And again, I have 54 V-stitches and 54 chain 4 spaces. All right, row 22. This is going to be the last round of this part, and I'll link part 4 at the end of this. And so, or if you're doing this as we're crocheting along across the 5 weeks, it'll be next week. So go ahead and slip stitch into the V-stitch. You're going to chain up 4. And now you're going to put 8 trebles into the same V-stitch. So you'll have a total of 9 trebles in this V-stitch, including that chain 4 space. Number 5. And 6. 7. 8. It's 2, 4, 6, 8. We need one more for a 9th treble. Okay, so this is going to be the base of your first pineapple for the next row of pineapples, and we're going to have 27 pineapples that we're going to work on in part 4. So to make sure that we get all of our other 26 spaces, this is going to be the beginning of your repeat. You're going to chain 1 and you're going to do a V-stitch in the next V-stitch. So double crochet, chain 2, and double crochet. You're going to chain 1 and put 9 trebles into this next V-stitch. Two, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and 9. Alright, so that's what it's going to look like. You're going to do a chain 1, a V-stitch into the V-stitch, a chain 1, and then 9 trebles into the following V-stitch. Repeat that all the way around another 25 times, and you will finish up with a V-stitch in a V-stitch and slip stitching to the top of this chain 4. All right, so I've just completed my last V-stitch in a V-stitch. I'm going to chain 1 and slip stitch to the top of that chain 4 that made our very first treble. I am going to go through the back bump as well as the side of that chain, and there we are. So just to update you guys and give you the count one more time, it is going to be 243 trebles, which equals 27 of your 9 treble clusters. This is going to be the base. They're going to be the bases of your next set of pineapples, and then you should have 27 V-stitches and 54 chain 1 spaces. So thank you so much for tuning into part 3, and I look forward to doing part 4 with you.